Jeff Goodell has covered climate change for more than 2 decades at Rolling Stone, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications. A 2020 Guggenheim Fellow, his work has been recognized by the American Meteorological Society, New America, and the inaugural Covering Climate Change Now Journalism Awards for feature writing. He is a senior fellow at the Adrian Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, and he serves on the board of the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. And Jeff will be joined in conversation with local author Nikisha Elise Williams. So interviewer Nikisha is a 2-time Emmy Award-winning producer, an award-winning author and producer, and host of the Black and Published podcast. Her latest novel, The 7 Daughters of Dupree, was acquired by Scout Press and will be published in 2025. We're very excited for her. Yeah. So she is a Chicago native, but Jacksonville now claims her a little bit. She is a columnist with Jax a Day, and her work has also appeared in The Washington Post, Essence, and Vox. And she currently lives here in Jacksonville with her family, and we're very happy to have her. So Nikisha, I'll leave the rest to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So your last book, The Water Will Come, was about sea level rise. And if you have read The Heat Will Kill You First, or even if you haven't, spoiler alert, the reason the water is coming is because the heat. And as you lay out, the heat will kill you before the water does. So my first question for you, because you lay this out in chapter 5 in the book, is how do you define heat?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming out to hear us just talk about this, and thank you for the library and all the partners for making this possible, and for everyone on Zoom for joining us, and to you, Nikisha, for reading the book and engaging in this conversation with me. How do I define heat? I mean, heat, that's an interesting question, and it goes to sort of why I decided to write this book, because I had been thinking about climate change, writing about climate change for a very long time, several decades. I wrote the book about sea level rise, which, as you pointed out, has a lot to do with melting glaciers and heat. The phrase global warming has, it's not a secret that heat is involved in that. That's not like exactly buried in the phrase. But I had never really thought about the consequences of heat until I happened to be in Phoenix on a really hot day in the summer of 2018. I had a meeting downtown. I was there for something completely different. I had a meeting downtown. It was really hot. I missed my Uber. I decided to run 25 blocks downtown in the middle of summer to my meeting. And by the time I got there, I was dizzy, my heart was pounding, and I thought, oh my gosh, this heat is really dangerous. And, it sounds crazy to say that I had never really realized that, but I had never really realized that. And that's the moment when this book was born. And to your question, though, I called my friend, another journalist, that night and explained my experience. And I explained that how naive I felt about not really understanding the sort of how dangerous heat is in a personal way. And I also remember talking to him that night saying, I don't even know what heat is. I could have told you what temperature was. I knew the difference between 75 and 95 degrees. But if you asked me what is heat, I could not have told you. And that, to me, was a pretty interesting hole in my knowledge after having covered climate change for 20 years. And I thought, okay, there's maybe an interesting book here. And it was really that day in Phoenix, with that run 20 blocks downtown, the sort of feeling of the immediacy of the danger of heat and the understanding that I didn't know what heat was, that it was the genesis of this book. And to answer what heat is vibration. Heat, when you put your hand on a hot cup of coffee and you feel the heat in your fingers, there's nothing that is physically being transferred. It's not like some invisible fluid. It's not something like that. It is just the vibration in the molecules of the cup are moving faster. That vibration is transferred to your fingertips. That registers in your brain as heat. So when we think about a hotter world, you can think about it as a world that has a faster metabolism, where things are moving faster. And that's a simple definition of what heat is. Just last definition also is that, heat is very different in Jacksonville than it is in other places. So, 100 degrees in Jacksonville is different than 100 degrees in Phoenix. And so heat is also, how we experience heat is also relative, but that's a whole other topic.
Which you also cover, talking about the difference between wet heat, which we experience a lot in Florida, versus dry heat, but the dangers of both. I think I prefer the definition that you have on page 105 of heat being the manifestation of energy. And even looking at it as like the metabolism and going from that standpoint, reading the book, like literally the prologue scared the living daylights out of me. You talk about trees screaming, salmon swimming with a bag over their head, baby hawk and eagles leaping to their deaths, and then caterpillars and maggots thriving while people are dying mid-action. I started the book 2 weeks ago. I read the prologue and I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll come back to this in a few days because I'm kind of depressed. But in starting with such an alarm, you then lay out a story where you travel all around the world, from the South Pole to the North Pole nearly, and everywhere in between, and talk to people who also do so to quantify the risks of heat economically, bodily, what our jobs are going to look like. And the biggest takeaway that I had, as I told you a moment ago, was that heat is going to be a defining moment between the rich and the rest of us, the working, those who work indoors, who work remote like I do, like I don't have to go outside at all, versus those who do have to go outdoors or even commute. And so I'm gonna ask a very basic question. How did we get here?
Well, we got here by burning a lot of fossil fuels for a couple hundred years is how we got here. But I think that, the point you're making about, the opening of the book being scary, it goes to also the title of the book, right? The Heat Will Kill You First, which was not something, when you think, this, I'm sure you have a new book you're coming up with, you're publishing very soon. I don't know how settled you are in the title or what you went through.
It changed.
Sorry?
It changed.
Yeah. and titles are really hard, but they're really important. And I came up, my Water Will Come book, the publisher had, that was a brilliant title that my publisher came up with. My title was really lame. This title I came up with, and my publisher was immediately like, no, that is a very, very bad title. You are not going to publish, that we need to go back, Jeff, go back to your desk, come back in a week with some new ideas. This is not going to happen. Nobody will buy a book called The Heat Will Kill You First. That is just the stupidest idea ever. And I went back to my little hole for a week, came up with some other ideas. They were all equally lame. And I really made the point. I said, look, I really want to call this book The Heat Will Kill You First, because I think one of the problems, and this goes to what you're talking about at the opening, one of the problems of how we think about the climate crisis and how we think about this change that is happening in our world is that it feels very remote. It feels like something that's might happen to future generations. You got to worry, we're thinking about our grandchildren, our children, people who live in distant places, glaciers that we'll never see, all this stuff. It's like, I don't mean to be, it's just like one of these sort of background noises of our lives, which I really think is a problem in how we talk about and communicate this. And so with this book, I really wanted to make it visceral. I wanted it to be about what heat does to you and why it can kill you fast in 2 hours. If you're in the wrong place on the wrong day in the wrong time and you're not prepared. And talking about not just what it does to you, but what, as you pointed out, what it does to every living thing, right? Salmon spawning upstream, and when it gets hot, their oxygen levels in the water are much lower, so they can't breathe. What it does to plants you talked about the trees screaming. There's been scientists who actually have put microphones in trees and captured the sounds of trees screaming in the heat as they try to suck water up through the dried soils to get some relief. I'm trying to capture the sort of profundity of this change, and every writer, when they have reviews, they read them with trepidation and thrill and anger, and it's a very emotional thing, as anyone does. But one of my favorite lines in any of the reviews of this book, which were generally really good, was that the reviewer compared it to a horror novel. And
accurate.
And I'm like, okay, good, I succeeded. Not because, novels, of course, are not true. This is true. But I really wanted it to have that visceral feeling, and just to, make clear, I am not a doomer. This is not a doomsday book. I have a lot of hope and optimism that we can talk about. But
Do you? Because it does not come across in the text.
Oh, come on.
Okay, maybe in the epilogue, in the last lines.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah. And it'll come across in the paperback, in the revisions. No, but I do have a lot of hope, and we can talk about that. But the main point of this book is to, alert people, to help people understand more deeply what heat means and what it does to our bodies, what the risk is, and what it does to our world.
I think it's very clear on page 38, you call heat a lethal weapon. Later in the book, someone, I think on your Arctic trip, someone says that, it's a mass extinction event that heat can cause. And yet, while no human has recollection of this, the Earth has gone through these mass extinctions because of heat before, and we have lost entire species. And now we are a species on the brink of being lost because of our own actions. As you mentioned, we got here very simply through hundreds of years of burning fossil fuels. And while there are climate agreements and climate acts passed, what really sticks out is that, as I go back to thinking about the rich and the rest of us, it's not just the class divide of people in America, it's a class divide of people globally. And so those that we consider first world developed nations, global north, like the United States, are responsible for more than their portion of burning of fossil fuels and contributing to the CO2 that is in the atmosphere. And yet it's places like Pakistan, which you point out has 1/25 of the CO2 pollution per capita as polluters, right. And yet they're having 130-degree summers.
Right.
And so in titling the book, The Heat Will Kill You First, and alarming readers and audiences and people in general, it still seems like not enough.
You mean I didn't solve the problem?
No, I'm not looking for a solution, but I'm saying we're sitting here in an air-conditioned room on a 90-degree day.
Right.
We mostly probably drove here in our cars that probably guzzle gas. And so we're talking about this problem that does not affect us yet, even though it does. And so how do you, I guess, get through that dissonance that exists in people's minds that, yes, we know it's a problem. Yes, we know we need to make solutions and inroads to cut our fossil fuel usage. And yet none of us are probably going to go vegan anytime soon unless we already are. The switch to electric vehicles, while there are rebates, is not really viable or even in the budget. My car is 10 years old. I'm like, I want to buy an electric car. And then all the little electric cars I see are real cute, and I have 2 children, and I'm a single parent with a house. And so I'm like, anything that I need to buy has to be delivered. So maybe I should get an SUV. And then I'm like, ooh, that's gas, right? So
not necessarily. I mean, there's certainly SUVs that are electric.
I've been looking at those, still on the fence. But we are very comfortable with what you talk about in the book. And so again, how do you get through that dissonance of our comfort hasn't yet been disrupted by this lethal weapon that we can all feel, but just take as a fact of life?
Well, okay, that's a very big question. And I think it's an important one. One of the things I want to just to push back a little bit on the way you framed it is, I don't think you mentioned that we humans are on the verge of extinction because of heat. I don't feel that. I don't feel like climate change is an extinction event for humans in any way. I think that it is a predatory event. I think that it preys on the most vulnerable people. Heat, I call, as a predatory force. Elon Musk can go live on Mars, no problem. It's okay. Elon and Bill Gates and the folks like that are going to be okay, right? And many of us in this room will probably be okay in the biggest kind of sense. But there are billions of people on this planet who are not going to be okay. And that is true both in a local way, the difference in people suffering from heat events in the wealthier parts of Jacksonville from the poorer parts, people who have access to air conditioning, people who don't, people who have health conditions, people who don't. There's all kinds of dividing lines. The sort of justice issue on this is, the center of the sort of the dilemma that we face here is this line between who's vulnerable and who's not. And that's something that's very global, and is this question that you've brought up, which I think is the central question in the climate fight and in this transformation that we're going through, is what do the people who caused the problem owe to the people who didn't cause the problem, right? I mean, the global north got rich burning fossil fuels and industrializing and all that. And now a large proportion of those problems are being borne by people in, poor neighborhoods in Jacksonville, poor neighborhoods in Austin, where I live, Bangladesh, Sub-Saharan Africa, people who do not have the same kind of resources, who are suffering these damages. And so the question is, what does justice look like? How does that get played out? So that's, a kind of big picture thing. Just to go back to the, what do we do now? First of all, I think this transformation is happening really fast. There's a lot of good things that are happening that I really want to underscore. I live in Austin, Texas. Hardly the tree hugger cat. Well, Austin is a little different, but Texas, Texas is hardly, it's one of the ancestral homes of fossil fuel in America. We do not suffer from an, overpopulation of tree huggers in Texas. And yet, I checked the grid last week, and 70% of the power on the grid was coming from renewable sources. We're doing better than California, where I grew up, and where there are, frankly, a number of tree huggers. And tree hugging is not helping. Texas is doing really well because the technological transformation is happening so fast. Renewable energy is cheaper, faster to build. There's nobody who is, if you're thinking about, everyone who always talks about, power of capitalism and all that kind of thing. Well, if you're thinking about this from a strictly capitalistic point of view, you would never build a fossil fuel plant anymore. Renewable stuff is way cheaper, and it's going to get cheaper and cheaper as innovation happens. Same thing with electric cars. Yes, I understand it's important. They're expensive right now. They're a little bit more, depending on how you parse it and everything, than internal combustion engine cars. But we've been building internal combustion engine cars for 100 years, and there's tons of subsidies and everything. Electric cars are going to be way cheaper and way more reliable in a very few years. The innovation curve on electric cars is really going to be fast. I mean, I grew up in Silicon Valley. I worked at Apple back when Steve Jobs was running around barefoot yelling Bob Dylan lyrics at all of us. I saw the first personal computer was like really expensive. I couldn't buy it. I couldn't afford it. Now my iPhone in my pocket here has, I don't know what the number is, 1,000 times the computing power that those first PCs had. And that same kind of exponential change is going to happen in all this stuff. And so I'm very optimistic in the long run about the energy part of this change. The problem is the fossil fuel industry still has a lot of political power. They're doing everything they can to slow down this transition, to extend their life as long as possible. And the other half of it that I'm really concerned about is how are we going to adapt to this warmer world? Because it's easy to see how the engine of entrepreneurialism and capitalism works on the energy side. Because you can make a lot of money if you figure out how to do a cheaper solar panel, or if you have a better battery technology, you're going to be the next Elon Musk, right? You're not going to be the next Elon Musk figuring out how to build cool bus stops, right? I mean, the adaptation side is a whole different economic dynamic. And that's the part that concerns me.
You mentioned the word justice, and this is one of my favorite chapters. Page 120, it's like the anatomy of a crime scene is a chapter, but on page 120 you say, at some point in the not so distant future, the question of who burned the fossil fuel that caused the heat wave that killed Jane Doe will become the climate version of who pulled the trigger of the gun that killed Jane Doe. And I think what goes hand in glove with that distant future is the chapter where you talk about the Arsht Foundation and what they're doing to name heat waves, and then using that to rank them as well. And so if you can point to so-and-so, Jane Doe was killed in heat wave Zoe, as they did in, what was that, Spain? Then I think you have a greater argument, which is a narrative strategy more so than a political one. Do you think approaching climate justice, yes, but then also how we reckon with and try to reverse climate change from a point of view that is not steeped in politics is more effective than what we're currently doing now with the fighting in Congress and partisanship?
That's a really interesting question. It's really interesting that you pointed to that chapter, because it's also one of my favorite chapters and one of the things I think is most important. So just to be clear, she's talking about a chapter about a scientist who is the leader in what's called attribution science, right? So there's a new kind of dimension of climate science that is allowing scientists to better attribute extreme events to higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it used to be, up until very recently, if a hurricane comes and wipes out Jacksonville, there would be media people, journalists would call up scientists and they would say, well, we can't say it was caused by higher levels of CO2. What higher levels of CO2 does is load the dice and makes it more likely, but no, because obviously there have been hurricanes that have been hitting Jacksonville and Florida for as long as Jacksonville and Florida have been here, right? And so this question of is burning fossil fuels and higher levels of CO2 causing these events has always been a very difficult link to make. But this attribution science that I write about in this chapter, they're beginning to be able to attribute extreme events to the higher levels of CO2. So, for example, I talk about in the book the heat wave that hit the Pacific Northwest in 2021, killed 1,000 people. That was the opening chapter with the stories about the salmon and everything. The scientists have been able to say, basically, this event could not have happened without the higher levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. In other words, this was caused by these extreme levels of CO2. And so what that does, that you so astutely kind of connect with, is it changes the political dynamic and it changes the legal dynamic. Because now, all of a sudden, you can say, oh, well, this heat event in the Pacific Northwest that caused so much damage, well, that was caused by our burning of fossil fuel. And we can quantify that. We can say how many tons we've put into the air. And then we can say, oh, well, hey, ExxonMobil, you've contributed 5% of global CO2 emissions historically, or whatever the exact number is. So maybe you're liable for 5% of the damages from this event. And when you think about that over a global scale, if you amplify that from just this one heat wave to other climate events, you begin to see why more and more people are comparing big oil to big tobacco, especially because we've had 40 years of what is clearly they've known about the damages and the risks of this. And so it opens up this whole new political aspect, which is about litigation and legal. You guys knew this was going to cause damage. You greenwashed and deceived and muddled the science. And now we know we can prove in a court of law that this event was attributable to to this product that you have been selling, knowing it was dangerous. So, you're responsible for this. You're accountable for this. And this is one of the reasons why there are now, I think, I don't have the exact number, something above 2,100 lawsuits right now around the world against fossil fuel industry, looking at this question of accountability and liability for this product that they knew was dangerous.
Yes, but litigation takes time.
Yes.
Lots of time, especially in this country.
Yes.
So in the interim, while the courts nationally and globally are trying to figure out what kind of accountability, probably civilly, which means money, that these oil companies and other fossil fuel expenders are going to have to pay to fix the issue, you also kind of end the book talking about some of the things that are happening to not only adapt, but to reverse. And I know it had been joked about, and you mentioned it in the book about like the big CO2 vacuum that we're going to deploy to space and vacuum all the CO2 out of the sky and then bury it in the ground. I see someone's laughing in the front like, that sounds real dumb. But as well as, talking about spewing particles of sulfur into the sky to act as a reflector, or deploying a sunshade, so like put a huge awning over the earth. What is the feasibility of these, what seems to be far-fetched ideas, but probably not, since we can still put a man on the moon, these ideas to do something to try to slow the warming, as people try to wrap their minds around what it's going to look like to adapt not only to the heat, but also our behavior to bring the temperature of the earth down?
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier that I wrote a book called The Water Will Come about sea level rise. Well, the book before that was called How to Cool a Planet, and it was about geoengineering. It was about all this stuff that we're exactly talking about. And in contrast to this book, which did very well and has been sort of widely read, I think if all of you in the room bought a copy of How to Cool the Planet, it would double the total sales of that book. It was, I think it's a very good book, but it was maybe an idea ahead of its time. But, to be clear, what we're talking about here is deliberately manipulating the Earth's climate in order to cool things off, right? So the most plausible scenario for this that you mentioned is this idea of using high altitude airplanes to put sulfate particles in the stratosphere, which act as tiny reflectors. And all you have to do is reflect away 1 or 2% of the sunlight, and you can lower the Earth's temperature by several degrees. Scientists know this works because volcanoes do this. They erupt, they put particles high in the stratosphere. Those particles in the stratosphere cool things down. Eventually, in a couple of years, those particles rain out of the sky and everything goes back to normal. So in theory, if we were in an emergency situation where we wanted to cool off the planet very quickly, we could have a fleet of high altitude airplanes. It wouldn't take that many, flying around constantly with little sprayers, putting essentially sulfate particles up in the stratosphere. Now, sounds like a crazy idea. It is a crazy idea. I'm not advocating it. I think, we could talk for hours about all the potential consequences of this and the whole problem of playing God this way with the climate, and the whole notion that it's not like we've done such an excellent job of managing the planet so far that we're going to just be masterful at this. There's all kinds of problems. And, you can read about it in my book if you are really interested in it. But The bottom line is that, I do feel like we're heading in that direction, bad idea or not, because, we've had 10 of the last 10 years have been the hottest 10 years that humans have ever recorded. There's still a lot of debate among the best climate scientists about why 2023 was so hot, not beyond what the models projected, but beyond what most climate scientists expected. It was a combination of the CO2 is driving it, of course, but also we had El Nino. There are a lot of factors. But if we get into a situation where, this warming gets more and more intense, and there begins to become more of a kind of panic about what to do about this, then I expect these geoengineering ideas to be taken more seriously. And, like I think I said in the book, it's a sort of a bad idea whose time is coming.
Yes. Just for note, if you have questions for Jeff, you have notepads or something, cards on your seat, go ahead and write them down. They'll be collected in about 10 minutes so that we can get your questions in. I will continue with mine. While those far-flung ideas may come to fruition, what will also come to fruition, what we have already experienced due to heat, in part, are more global pandemics. And you talk about how in a warmer planet that allows certain species who carry viruses to quickly have those viruses jump species to infect us, like we saw with COVID-19 in late 2019 and, of course, all of 2020. Can you talk more about the threats? Because it's not just the heat will kill you first or the water will come. It's also, even as you adapt, there could be other microscopic things that are out to get you, literally.
There are always microscopic things out to get you. It's the story of life. I want to just, that's a great question, and I think it's a really important question, but I wanted to just say one thing that I neglected to say in the geoengineering answer, which is, I want to be very, very clear that the reason temperatures are rising is because we're continuing to burn fossil fuels, which is putting CO2 into the atmosphere. As long as we continue putting CO2 in the atmosphere, it is going to get hotter. So slowing the emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere is really important because it will slow down the increase of heat. But even when we get to what we call net zero emissions of CO2 into the atmosphere, that is not going to bring it back to the climate that we had when we were all growing up. All that will do is stop the heating at that level. Really important idea to communicate about climate change. I think even educated audiences like y'all here don't get is that, we are moving into a permanently different climate. We are not going back. Climate change is not like a broken leg. We become good people. We buy electric cars. We recycle bottles. We don't eat meat, all that, and we go back to the climate that we had. We are living in a different climate. We have permanently altered, for all intents and purposes, our climate, and so that's a really important sort of baseline understanding, especially in the context of geoengineering, because clearly the best way to geoengineer the planet is to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the way to deal with this, instead of putting the stuff up there. As for disease, I think that's a really, one of the hard things to communicate and think about when it comes to climate is these cascading effects. It's, as you said, it's not just about, if you go for a hike on a day when the heat index is 105 degrees and you go climb a mountain with no shade, you're going to have problems and you may die. Or that's sort of an obvious thing. What's less obvious is the way that these changes in heat affect all other animals and how these kinds of cascading impacts happen, right? So as you pointed out, animals are like humans. When it gets too hot, we move to different places. They migrate. And in the case of disease, there's two issues. One is the vector-borne diseases that are carried by animals like mosquitoes and ticks. So things like malaria, dengue fever, Zika, as mosquitoes and ticks, which are very sensitive to climate, move, they carry these new diseases with them. So we've seen a resurgence in malaria, some new cases last year for the first time in decades in the United States. Consequences of this in sub-Saharan Africa are huge as these temperature ranges change. The mosquitoes that carry the malaria move to new regions. People are unprepared for it. So that's one aspect of it that is really important. But the other one that you're suggesting is that, we know that that these pandemics, the risky thing about the sort of breeding ground for pandemics is the jumping of viruses from one species to another, right? And the virus jumping from one species to another, finding a new host, mutating within that host, and then mutating in ways that makes us more vulnerable to them, right? So one of the things that's happening with climate change is that animals are moving to new places. Bats, it's too hot, I'm getting out of here, are moving to a new place. The bats are going to different places, all kinds, birds are moving in new ways. All kinds of animals are moving in new ways. And, one of these scientists that I quote in the book, who's one of the sort of country's top experts in this kind of pandemics, the birth of pandemics, calls it meet cutes between different new animals have never met before. Like, Mr. Bat comes up and says, "Hi, Mr. Coyote, I've never seen you before." And a
pandemic romance.
A pandemic romance, right. Exactly. Yeah. And so that's one of these consequences of heat that we don't think about as a first order. Another just example that is different but totally similar is, as things migrate and move, as people migrate and move, the potential for war and conflict rises hugely, right? It's changing our national politics. It's changing the politics of Europe right now. Migration is obviously, the big story in American politics and increasingly around the world. And migration is caused by many things, but one of the things it's caused by is a changing climate, food scarcity, disease changes, economic issues. We know that a hotter planet is a more chaotic planet.
So then what can we do? You talk about your optimism. Here you go. What can we do to keep the chaos where it is if we can't fully reverse it?
Right. Well, so what can we do? I mean, there's obviously many things that we can do. And I think most people know, the basics of their personal, how they can make a personal impact by reducing their use of fossil fuels. We just put a heat pump in our house instead of a natural gas furnace. You mentioned electric vehicles, all that kind of stuff. That stuff has been, talked about ad nauseum. I think everybody knows about that. I think the second level of this is political. Obviously, we have the technology, we have all the know-how to do this. We need the political will to make this happen. This is a particularly poignant point here in Florida, given that your governor just outlawed. Sorry? Yeah. Yeah.
And it's not allowed in legislation.
Right.
It's not allowed to direct any energy policy in the state.
Right. So
and hurricane season is coming.
Right. Yeah. But one of the challenges that what Governor DeSantis did, underscores the political challenge, which is this is obviously performative politics, right? This is making this about the culture wars. There's still a lot of funding that's going into climate adaptation projects in Florida, seawalls, all kinds of things like that. It's just happening kind of under the radar. But the larger point I want to make is that one of the difficulties in sort of the politics of thinking about this is, sustaining the momentum of this over time, right? So Governor DeSantis will be gone. I remember when I first started reporting here, yeah, but when I first started reporting in Florida for my sea level rise book, Governor Christ was, very progressive on all this stuff. And then you have a change of administrations and everything changes. And, the same thing nationally, right? We had Obama as president, better and worse. He did, but he basically was, on board with this. He did a lot of really great things in thinking about the energy transition and climate. Then we had another guy who came in and who thought that climate change was a hoax perpetuated by the Chinese. And so a lot of things were set back. And now we have President Biden, who's done arguably more than any other American president. Inflation Reduction Act has been amazingly successful. Huge transformation of how we fund projects, both on the energy side and the adaptation side. But in November, that could all change again. And so the complexity of dealing with this politically is how to sustain these sort of bigger momentum so that it's not this sort of yo-yo effect.
All right. Gabrielle has an announcement.
Well, I'm going to open it up for audience questions. So thank you for a great conversation thus far, Jeff and Nikisha. But we are going to open it up. So if you did take the time and write a question, please, if you are in the inner part of the row, pass it down. And I and a volunteer will be around to collect some. But in the meantime, I will let Nikisha ask her last question.
So you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act as being something that no other American president has done in the manner of addressing the climate. And yet I was reading, I don't remember, it was an article about the short term. And so I wonder, in the short term, we have allowed more drilling. We had to make sure that gas remains cheap so that people can get to work who don't have a higher income or are able to work remotely. So while there's the balance of making sure that people can still access fossil fuels, which put more CO2 in the atmosphere, while also trying to expand the ways that we think about clean energy, renewable energy sources, and shift away from burning fossil fuels. Does that approach, because it is a political approach to keep your base happy while also trying to move progressively forward, does that do more harm than good?
Well, we would all wish that this could happen in a very, the urgency of this is very apparent. We all wish that this could happen in a kind of very straightforward way, that we could just sort of get off fossil fuels tomorrow and make this shift to renewable energy, very radically. But of course, that's not going to happen. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not going to happen. And so, I think that the idea that, we'd be critical, that I would be critical. I'm critical of President Biden on a number of things, and I don't. I wish that for example, he's talked a lot about eliminating subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. We still, in the United States, fund tens of billions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry in subsidies, which is insane given the political power and money that they have. So I think things like that, getting these kinds of more practical changes, possible changes that we can do to kind of level the playing field. But even the most radical climate activists are not advocating like stopping fossil fuels tomorrow, right? That's just not going to happen. But what I think drives a lot of people who are take this energy transformation seriously is these things like these subsidies, is the idea of banks still giving cheap loans and funding a lot of these fossil fuel projects, opening up new areas to drilling. These things are steps that we can take right now to accelerate this transition. What we need to do is accelerate the transition to renewable energy, not outlaw fossil fuels tomorrow, because that's just, insane, right?
So first question from the audience. How does the impact of fracking affect the climate and heat? And are there any practices of collecting fossil fuels that can act as a sort of lesser evil?
Well, it's interesting. Fracking is, natural gas, fossil gas, was initially positioned by the industry as this climate-friendly solution, because the idea was it was going to displace coal, right? That instead of burning coal, which is the most carbon-intensive fossil fuel, we would make a lot of progress by replacing coal with what was then called natural gas, more accurately called fossil gas, with gas production. But now it's become clear we know a lot better about the risks and the dangers of gas, especially methane. These natural gas, fossil gas is the same thing as methane. And the leakage of methane from the pipelines and from the power plants themselves. And methane is 30, 40 times more potent than CO2 as a warming gas. And so there's a strong argument to be made that natural gas, or fossil gas, is not any better climate-wise than coal is anyway. So there's a big push right now by the administration and by others to develop more gas, more liquefied gas exporting, which is a step in the wrong direction, right? We need to accelerate the progress, the transition to renewables. They're cheaper. The long-term strategy is that's the direction we need to go. Gas is not a bridge fuel. It is a perpetuation of the problem.
Someone says the growing industry of electric cars has an impact on the climate. Are electric cars a short solution?
A short solution?
Sure, S-U-R-E.
Well, I think electric cars, I mean, if it were up to me, I would, spend all my extra pocket money on developing public transportation and, it's the whole, replacing internal combustion engines with electric vehicles is certainly a big step in the right direction. But, we need to rethink how we build cities, how we do public transportation. I mean, electric cars are not a panacea for all of these other urban transportation issues and climate issues, but they are a big step in the right direction. And, they've gotten, kind of a bad rap in the last few months. Trump and others are, trying to demonize them and range anxiety and all that. It's like the electric vehicle thing, the ship has sailed. This transformation is going to happen. The advantages of electric cars are so huge. They're going to be so much cheaper. The performance of them is going to be so fantastic. It's already very fantastic. I remember when I was back home in Silicon Valley on a reporting trip like 15 years ago, whenever it was that Elon Musk first bought into Tesla, I got a call, and it was from Elon's assistant asking if I wanted to go talk to him about his new company, Tesla, which I had never really heard of. And it was at the time when they had just developed the first Roadster. And Elon and I went for a drive in the hills in this Roadster. And it was immediately clear to me that electric vehicles were awesome and we're going to replace internal combustion engines. And I think that's, these issues right now about charging and, range anxiety, all this is, we've only been sort of rolling these out a few years. All this stuff is going to get solved, no question. There are certainly issues with critical metals, with the batteries and all that, but all this stuff, I think will be solved in the near term. And I think the trajectory is very clear on all this.
Are the wildfires around the world part of a cycle with the heat contributes to their spread and then the fires add to the climate issues?
Yes, that's very straightforward. Yes. I mean, it's well proven and well known, even just if you think about it for a few minutes, how heat contributes to the size and scale and intensity of these fires, right? I mean, anyone who's ever, built a fire in their fireplace or camp or something knows that, dry wood burns better than wet wood. And so as the planet heats up, as the soils become drier, as the timber and the forest become more stressed and drier, they're more flammable. So when they do ignite, they burn bigger, hotter, longer. And then there's the questions of, we mentioned insects and how they are, vector diseases borne by ticks and mosquitoes. Well, there's also lots of changes in insect infestation of forests that make them more vulnerable to fires. So yes, they are absolutely directly attributable. And then, of course, when the forests burn, as everyone on the East Coast of the United States discovered last summer, that wildfire smoke drifts around. Wildfire smoke has particulate matter in it that is very, very dangerous to your health, especially to anyone who has any kind of heart conditions or to young people or anything like that. So it's one of these sort of compounding effects of heat that is very kind of straightforward and terrifying.
All right. Given that we have a stack of questions in 5 minutes, I'm pulling from everywhere. So be mindful. Your signing line is going to be really, really long. Will the best solutions to slowing climate change come from science, legislation, or innovation with a profit motive, i.e. capitalism?
All of the above, obviously. But, I do think it's I think we have the technology we need. I think it's really a political problem right now. It's not a technological problem. It's not a science. Science is very straightforward. I mean, we've known, the basics of climate change have been very clear for a very long time. It's all politics right now. It's just a question of political will and willingness to change our world.
Can you speak to the risks to the Atlantic Meridional? I don't know what that word is. Sorry.
Overturning circulation. Yeah.
That one. You got it.
Yeah. So the AMOC, as it's called, is, you can think of it as sort of like the Gulf Stream. It's a circulation of warm tropical waters in the Atlantic up to the north, to Greenland and to the Arctic, where it cools off, sinks, and is this kind of conveyor belt of circulation that is one of the big kind of controlling mechanisms for our climate. And from the very first time I started thinking about climate change, the question of slowing down of this circulation pattern of this conveyor belt in the Atlantic has been a big question. I don't know if any of you ever saw the movie The Day After Tomorrow, which is about this all of a sudden shutting down of this, and all the kind of chaos it causes. And it's been kind of batted back and forth. It's a very complicated, subtle thing to try to understand the mechanism of this, how it works, whether it's slowing or not slowing. But this year, there's been a number of pretty definitive papers coming out that have shown that yes, it is beginning to slow, and that there is a risk of it shutting down. I think that the risk is not the sort of day after tomorrow risk that we're going to wake up one morning and it's going to be a completely different climate on our planet. But I do think it's one of, there's no global tipping point for climate change. There's no moment when everything's good, and then you wake up the next day and it's like, okay, we're all screwed. Let's just go to the beach and have a beer, and but there are regional and smaller and ecosystem tipping points, and this is one of them. West Antarctic ice sheet is one of them. Amazon rainforest is one of them, and it is alarming.
In your travels, have you come across the regressive climate politics we're experiencing under DeSantis, i.e. the heat safety ban and removing the term climate change from state law?
Hey, I live in Texas.
I figured that was going to be the answer.
You guys are just pikers here. Yeah, it is a tie. So yes, I certainly have. We have other things we can talk about. It is a kind of performative politics. There is two levels of things happening here. There is this anti-woke, trying to make climate change part of the sort of woke agenda, which is all just sort of the culture wars thing, which I think will fade. And at the same time, as we mentioned earlier, there still is a lot of funding going into a lot of adaptation stuff here in Florida, in Texas, we've seen, incredible boom in clean energy. So this is like a multi-dimensional chess game that's going on, but it's certainly like depressing and damaging and kind of utterly moronic that we have, governors who are trying to, ban the word climate change as if that's going to do anything. Like,
This question is not on the card. It's a question for me, because I think that even if we see the rhetoric of the culture wars recede, the harm that they have caused won't. And so, to the question on the card, what new or revised federal programs and legislation are needed to facilitate long-term, 50 to 100 plus years adaptation planning and actions? And that's from Glenn Landers. Thank you, Glenn.
Well, that's a really hard question, because it's so. Thank you, Glenn. Who I should say is I've known for a long time. He's a engineer with Army Corps for a long time. He was very instrumental in helping me with The Water Will Come. I'm very happy to see you here. The problem with how to think about adaptation is that it's so different everywhere, right? So. First of all, there's adaptation to sea level rise, adaptation to heat, adaptation to all these different kinds of things. And then there's, the adaptation in one neighborhood is different than an adaptation in another neighborhood. I think it's a really complex problem. And we obviously, need to start by acknowledging the risks, quantifying those risks, having a government that cares about those risks. But, just to change the subject from heat to sea level rise, there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. Building seawalls can certainly be helpful in some cases, but it can also be incredibly damaging in some cases, right? The idea that there's one size fit all solutions, building more kind of natural coastlines can be, in many cases, a more effective solution than seawalls. And then there's the really complex issues about relocation and about rebuilding. And do we rebuild in places? And how do we adapt to that? How do we think about moving people out of harm's way? What is the government's role in encouraging, if not requiring people to move out of risky areas. And, we're seeing that happen kind of in a de facto way in places like Florida with changing insurance rates, more and more difficulty with insurance. My mom has a house in California that, she's going to have to leave. We're going to have to sell because of wildfire risk, and insurance is so virtually impossible to get. So a lot of these adaptations are happening in the sort of market, and you could argue that these sort of stronger signals in the market would be a big part of it. But it's a really complex discussion,
Thank you.